In the freezing storm of the Bitterroot Mountains, an 11-year-old boy flees a burning cabin, clutching his baby sister. His stepfather had planned to burn her alive. Barefoot and bleeding, he collapses near a ravine until a three-legged dog appears, howling into the night. That moment, everything changes. Subscribe now so you won't miss any of our powerful and emotional survival films. The wind screamed like a living thing. It clawed down from the peaks of Bitterroot, dragging snow behind it like white fire. Trees groaned under the pressure, branches snapping in the dark like bones in a storm. The forest was a tangle of shadow and white noise, and beyond it, down a narrow ridge carved into the side of a mountain, a faint flicker of orange light burned against the snow. A cabin. A crooked one-room shack sagging under years of isolation and despair. Inside, chaos. The scent of gasoline filled the air, sharp, bitter, unmistakable. A man stumbled from corner to corner of the cabin, a metal gas can sloshing wildly in his hand. His coat was half-buttoned, his eyes glassy. A half-empty bottle of bourbon dangled from his other fist. "She ain't mine," he bellowed, voice splitting the wooden walls. "She's never been mine," the baby cried. A thin, reedy sound barely audible above the roar of the wind and the curse of her would-be killer. Her tiny limbs trembled in the cold air as she lay bundled in a worn blanket atop the makeshift cot. The room was too cold, too bright, too deadly. 11-year-old Logan stood frozen in the shadows near the wood stove, barefoot on the freezing plank floor, holding a fire poker like it might turn into something braver. His breath came out in shallow clouds. His eyes locked onto the man across the room. Silas, the only father figure he'd known since his mom died, giving birth to Luna just 3 weeks ago. Silas didn't cry when she passed. He drank. And then he started talking to the walls. "You brought this thing into my house," he spat toward the baby voice, rising, cracking. "Brought her into my world, like she's mine. But she ain't. She don't look like me. She don't cry like me. And you," he jabbed a finger toward Logan, "you always stare like you're waiting for someone to come rescue you. Ain't no one coming." Gasoline sloshed onto the wooden floor. The scent struck Logan like thunder. His fingers gripped tighter around the poker. His eyes flicked to Luna. Her cheeks were red with cold lips, slightly blue. Her cries turned into whimpers, then hiccuping gasps. Silas moved toward her. "Don't," Logan said. It came out as a whisper. Silas didn't stop. His hand hovered over the blanket over the tiny chest, still struggling to rise. "Don't touch her," Logan screamed. Silas turned, laughter bubbling up from somewhere dark in his throat. "You got guts now, huh? You gonna stop me, boy?" Logan stepped forward. His body was shaking so hard he could barely hold the iron. "She's my sister." Silas stared at him, blank, dangerous. "No. She's a curse, just like your mama." And then he lifted the gas can and turned it upside down over the crib. That's when Logan moved. He lunged forward with the fire poker, not thinking, not breathing. It cracked against Silas's shin with a sickening thud. The man let out a roar of pain, dropped the gas can, and stumbled backward. Logan dropped the iron bar, scooped Luna into his arms, and ran. He didn't look back. He didn't wait to see if Silas was following. He flung the cabin door open and was swallowed whole by the storm. The night hit him like a freight train. Wind slapped across his face. Snow bit into his bare arms like teeth. He couldn't feel his legs. The world was a swirl of white and darkness. Trees blurred past him as he ran, holding the baby close against his chest, shielding her with his body. His mind was blank. No thoughts, no plan. Just escape. Just get away. Just save her. He ran until his lungs burned, until his breath was fire and his legs buckled beneath him. The snow was knee-deep in some places, loose and slick in others. Branches scraped his face. His bare feet split open on frozen rocks. Every step he took left a bloodied print in the snow. Luna's cries grew weaker, softer. "Stay with me," he whispered. Not sure if he was talking to her or himself. "Don't go quiet on me, okay? I'm gonna fix this." But the wind swallowed his words. The forest didn't care. Somewhere behind them, far off now, came the sound of something crashing, wood splintering. A shout. Maybe just the wind. Logan didn't stop. Couldn't. He cradled Luna tighter, trying to share what little warmth he had left. Her head barely peeked out from the folds of the blanket. Her lips trembled. Her eyes fluttered. A cold wave of panic surged through him. "She's freezing," he murmured. "She's too cold." He fell once hard. His knee slammed against a buried root, and he bit down a cry. He didn't want to drop her. He didn't want her to hit the ground. Not ever. He crawled for a moment, both of them sinking into the snow. Then he saw something. A light. A flicker, faint golden, barely visible through the wall of falling snow. A cabin? Or maybe just his mind playing tricks. He pushed toward it. Each step now was agony. He could barely move. His arms numb, his skin cut open by wind and ice. The baby didn't make a sound anymore. "Luna," he whispered, "please, please." His foot caught on a root, and he fell again, this time, rolling, tumbling down a shallow slope. Snow exploded around him. The world tilted, spun, and slammed to a stop. He landed hard at the base of a boulder curled around Luna. His whole body screamed in pain. He tried to rise, but his arms wouldn't respond. His head lolled back. The trees spun above him. The light had vanished. His lips were purple now. Blood mixed with snow where it leaked from his split brow. He thought of his mother. Her hands, her smile, the way she used to sing about rivers that never froze. And then silence, a breath. Then a bark, a single sharp echoing bark that cut through the storm like a flare. Logan's eyes fluttered open. Snow crunched. A figure emerged from the woods, slow, steady, unmistakable. A dog, large, limping with one hind leg dragging awkwardly behind. His fur was a patchwork of golden tan and scarred black. His ears perked. His nose twitched. He sniffed the air and barked again, louder this time, urgent. Behind him another figure, a woman, bundled in a heavy army parka, her face half obscured by a scarf and goggles. Her gait was deliberate, practiced. She dropped to one knee beside the boy, peeled back her scarf, and touched his neck. "Jesus," she muttered. "He's still warm." She reached for the bundle in his arms, unwrapped the top corner. A baby, pale, motionless. Her eyes widened. "No." She pressed her fingers to the infant's chest, waited. 1 second. 2. Then a flutter. "Alive." "Bruno," she barked, snapping her fingers. "Go! Back! Go now!" The dog hesitated only a second before turning limping toward the direction they came from. The woman bent down, lifted both children into her arms, awkwardly, but without hesitation, and started walking. Not running, not panicking, just walking. Strong, determined. Her breath came out slow and steady steam curling into the wind. And somewhere in that blizzard-choked darkness, hope took one small step forward. The dog's bark split the night again. Short, sharp, urgent. It echoed across the frozen slope, rebounding off stone and tree like a siren. Mira paused mid-step, her snow-crusted boots crunching to a halt just beyond the ridgeline. Her breath steamed in the air. The rifle slung across her shoulder felt heavier than usual tonight. The storm had shifted. She felt it in the way the wind pressed against her face. Colder now, like a hand turning its knuckles inward. Bruno barked again, but not just a bark. A cadence she hadn't heard in years. High-low, pause, repeat. The alert sequence. Mira's fingers tightened on the leather strap of her pack. She moved forward slowly, cautiously, peering through the maze of pines and falling snow, until her eyes locked on a shape near the edge of a narrow gorge, half covered in white, barely more than a mound. Bruno stood beside it, his 3 legs stiff with tension, ears forward, head low. His breath came hard and fast, fogging up around his scarred muzzle. He looked back at her, then down again. Mira moved, not fast, deliberate, decisive. She had trained too long, seen too many broken bodies to let panic eat up precious seconds. She reached the shape, crouched low, brushed away, snow, and froze. It was a child, a boy, maybe 10, no older, 11 perhaps. Barefoot, frostbitten face, blue around the lips. His arms clutched something wrapped tightly in a threadbare blanket. Clutched it like it was life itself. Bruno whined softly. Mira's breath hitched. Not something, someone. She pulled the top fold back from the bundle and saw the baby's face, pinkish gray, nearly still. For one horrifying moment, Mira felt her chest freeze. Not from the cold, from memory, from the image of her own son's body in that dusty Afghan tent. Still, quiet, gone. She blinked the thought away. Her fingers found this baby's neck, waited. And there it was, soft fluttering, a heartbeat. The boy stirred then, barely. His lips trembled. "Luna," he whispered. Mira leaned closer. "Hey," she said, voice flat but calm. "Can you hear me?" The boy's eyes cracked open, glazed and unfocused. "Don't take her," he croaked. "I'm not," she said. "But if we don't move, neither of you will see morning." He didn't respond. Mira stood pulling off her glove and pressing 2 fingers to the pulse on his neck. Faint, thready, but still there. She glanced at the slope behind them, calculating the incline back to her cabin. It wasn't far, maybe a quarter mile. But in this wind, with 2 near-frozen kids in her arms, it might as well be Everest. She looked at Bruno. Pack. The dog turned and started limping up the hill without hesitation. Mira didn't waste another breath. She knelt, secured the baby tighter in the boy's arms with the remains of the blanket, then bent down, hooked her arms under his back and knees, and heaved. He was light, too light. The kind of light that told stories without words of skipped meals, long nights, and no one looking out for you. She carried him close, bracing her chin against his forehead as she trudged forward. Every step was fire in her thighs. Her boots slipped twice, but she caught herself. The wind screamed against her coat, cutting through the seams like razors. Her eyes narrowed to slits. Snow filled her lashes. Bruno barked ahead, circling back once to check she was still coming. "Keep going," she muttered. The cabin loomed ahead. Wooden slats warped from years of storms, roof patched with tin. Smoke curled from the chimney. A single lantern glowed inside, flickering against frost-bitten windows. Safety? Barely. She reached the porch, fumbled with the latch, shoved the door open with her shoulder. Warmth hit her like a wave. Not real warmth, just the relative absence of the cold. She stepped inside, kicked the door shut, and laid the boy down gently on the cot near the hearth. Then she turned, ripped off her gloves, and started unwrapping the baby. "Come on, little one," she whispered. The baby didn't move. Mira cursed under her breath, ran to the cabinet, yanked open a drawer, and grabbed the emergency field kit. Back beside the fire, she dipped her fingers into a tin of balm, rubbed it between her palms to warm it, then massaged it gently into the baby's limbs. Still nothing. "Breathe," she whispered. "Breathe for me." She reached for a soft wool wrap, tucked the baby into it, then held her under her coat, pressing the child against her bare skin, chest to chest, skin to skin. Bruno lay down beside the cot, his one good ear perked. Mira rocked slowly, humming a tune she hadn't thought of in years, a nursery melody from long ago. Then a sound, a hiccup, then a whimper. The baby stirred. Mira exhaled shakily. "That's it. That's my girl." She kept rocking until the whimper became a breath, then two, then a flutter of weak cries. Logan groaned. His body jerked slightly on the cot. His fingers moved as if still clutching the baby. Mira turned. "She's okay," she said. "You kept her safe." He tried to sit up but collapsed again. "You're okay too," she added, "for now." She moved quickly, stripping off his soaked hoodie and shirt, wincing at the bruises along his ribs. She wrapped him in 2 fleece blankets, added a heat pack near his spine, and checked his feet. The skin was pale waxy. Dangerous. She took out a basin, filled it halfway with lukewarm water, and lowered his feet in. Logan cried out, a hoarse, broken sound that wasn't entirely conscious. "I know," she whispered. "I know it hurts. That means there's still time." Outside, the storm howled. Inside, the fire began to eat into the pine logs, casting orange and gold across the cabin walls. Shadows danced, some slow, some sharp, the kind that reminded Mira of tents in the desert, of flickering flashlights, of quiet breathing beside the wounded. She wrapped the baby in fresh wool and placed her in a wooden crate lined with lambskin. Bruno got up and patted over, sniffing her face gently before lying down beside the crate like a guard. Logan's eyes fluttered open again. "Where are we?" he murmured. "My place," Mira said. "Middle of nowhere." He blinked. "Luna, sleeping, thanks to you." He nodded slightly. "You? Military?" was she replied shortly. "Why'd you help us?" She looked at him for a long moment. "Because someone needed to." Silence fell between them again. The fire cracked. Bruno let out a low sigh, settling deeper into the rug. Logan's eyelids drifted down. He was spent. Mira stood and went to the window. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes relentless. She couldn't see past the first line of trees, but she knew the world was still out there, dangerous, watching, waiting, and somewhere someone was going to come looking. She could feel it, not just in the soldier's instinct buried deep in her bones, but in the way the boy's body curled protectively in sleep, even now. In the haunted way, he'd said, "Don't take her like he'd lost too much already." Mira turned back toward the fire. Bruno raised his head and looked at her. She nodded once. Then she did something she hadn't done in years. She sat beside the boy, just sat. Not to heal, not to treat. Just to be there, in the quiet, in the warmth, in the moment between storms. The fire hissed. Pine resin snapped within the logs, sending tiny sparks upward into the cabin's dim air. A dull orange glow pulsed across the room, but it didn't reach the shadows near the door where Mira stood. Arms crossed, eyes narrowed her back, rigid like she was bracing for impact. She wasn't watching the flames. She was watching the boy. Logan lay curled on the cot, still wrapped in layers of wool. His lips had taken on a pale pink again, but his skin remained pallid, thin veins visible across his temples. He hadn't stirred in nearly 20 minutes, not fully, but his hands remained clenched around the edges of the fleece blanket knuckles, white arms forming a cradle around his baby sister. Mira hated how small he looked in that moment, not because she pitied him, because she remembered. She shook her head, rubbed her temples, and muttered aloud, "I don't do kids. Not anymore." Bruno, lying near the hearth, flicked one ear toward her, but didn't lift his head. "I mean it," she said, but her voice cracked just slightly. The dog noticed. She turned away from the cot, went to the kitchen corner of the room, and poured herself a mug of stale, lukewarm coffee. The metal cup burned her palms, but she didn't care. She brought it to her lips, didn't drink, just stood there, breathing, listening to the storm. Behind her, Logan stirred. Mira tensed. "Mom?" he mumbled. Her eyes closed. "Mom, please don't leave." The mug hit the table harder than it needed to. Mira marched back toward the fire, stopped at the crate where the infant slept. "Luna." Mira studied the baby's face, the tiny flutter of her nostrils, the way her breath caught every so often, like her lungs were learning how to fight. "She's too quiet," she muttered. Bruno stood. No command given. He simply rose, padded over to the crate, and sat beside it. The baby gave a faint sound, neither a cry nor a breath, more like a swallow that failed to finish. Mira crouched down, resting her hand just above the infant's ribcage. It rose, then stuttered. Then again, each inhale shallower than the last. Damn it! She reached for her medical bag. Years of dust zippers that stuck. The contents hadn't been touched in months, but her hands moved like no time had passed. Thermometer, pulse oximeter, flashlight, chest scope. She worked fast. "Come on, Luna, help me out here." Logan whimpered again behind her, still half asleep, trapped in fevered memory. "She's cold. Mama, she's too cold." Mira set the tools aside and picked Luna up. The baby's body felt like paper wrapped around porcelain, fragile with something hollow underneath. Mira listened close. The wheeze was faint, but present. She held the stethoscope to the baby's back, moved it down, then again. Rails, upper chest. No doubt. Bruno let out a quiet whine. Mira looked at him. "I know." She adjusted the baby against her shoulder, one hand rubbing slow circles across her back. She turned her head, speaking aloud, but maybe more to herself than the child. "This is bronchial restriction. Could be viral. Could be congenital. Hell, could be stress. But I've seen it before." She didn't say where. Didn't need to. Her mind already took her there. Kandahar, 2012. A dusty, half-collapsed refugee tent. A baby with the same sound, the same struggle to inhale. The medic who failed to get a chopper there in time. The way she'd carried the body out under cover of night while mortar shells rained across the ridge. Her fingers trembled. She blinked hard. "You're not dying on me." Luna twitched, then exhaled a tiny gasp that sounded like surrender. "No," Mira whispered. "Not tonight." She moved fast now. Pulled a dropper of mentholated extract from the old trauma kit, diluted it with warm water. Then drizzled a few drops onto a cotton swab. She placed it near the baby's nose, not too close. Let the vapors do the work. The baby coughed. Mira smiled grimly. "That's it, fighter. Don't quit." Behind her, Logan jolted upright. His eyes were wild, unfocused. Where is she?" Mira turned. "She's here." Logan scanned the room like someone had stolen time. When his eyes found Luna in Mira's arms, he scrambled off the cot, ignoring the pain in his legs as he staggered across the floor. Bruno moved to intercept, but Mira raised a hand. "Let him." Logan collapsed to his knees in front of them. His fingers reached out instinctively, brushing his sister's cheek. He looked like he might cry, but didn't. "She's warm," he whispered. "She wasn't," Mira replied. "But she will be." Logan nodded, still panting. "She always sleeps so quiet. Sometimes I worry. I used to put my head next to hers just to check." Mira's jaw clenched. He looked up at her. "Are you a doctor?" "No." "Then how do you know what to do?" She didn't answer. Logan didn't push. He lowered his gaze and shifted to sit beside the crate. Luna was breathing deeper now, still raspy, but no longer slipping. Her tiny fist opened for a second, then closed. "She's got that fight in her," Mira said softly. "So do you." Logan didn't smile. But he leaned against the side of the crate, still watching Luna. "Thank you," he murmured. Mira stood rubbing her neck, trying to shake off the ghosts crawling up her spine. "I didn't do it for thanks." Logan blinked. "Then why did you help?" Mira looked away. Bruno answered first, stepping forward and placing his snout against Logan's shoulder. He didn't lick, just stayed there, like anchoring him. Mira's voice came low, dry, like gravel on wet concrete. "I used to save people for a living. Sometimes I even got to bring them home." Logan looked at her. "What happened?" She stared into the fire. "One day, I didn't. And that was the last time." He waited, but Mira didn't continue. Instead, she turned her back, walked to the window, and stared into the storm. Outside, the trees were silent. Snow poured like static from the sky, layering everything under a hush so loud it was deafening. Logan pulled the blanket from the cot and wrapped it over his shoulders. "You're angry," he said softly. Mira didn't move. He swallowed. "But you still saved her." A long silence. Then barely audible, Mira spoke. She reminded me of someone. Bruno walked back to the crate, curled beside it, resting his chin on the edge. Luna's breathing steadied. A rhythm. Weak, but consistent. Mira pressed her hand against the window pane. She didn't see the woods. She saw dust. blood. A child with a name tag she never learned how to pronounce. A mother's scream. The sound of helicopter blades, never coming. Her voice cracked. I don't rescue kids anymore. Logan turned puzzled. But you did. I shouldn't have. His voice rose, timid but firm. You should have. She needed you. Mira finally turned to face him. Her expression was unreadable, like something half-shattered trying to stay intact. Don't count on me to keep doing it, she said. I'm not your answer. Logan met her eyes. I didn't ask you to be. And for the first time, Mira hesitated. Something in her chest shifted, painful, sharp, unfamiliar. Respect. Logan sat quietly beside Luna, one hand resting inside the crate, fingers curled near hers. His feet were wrapped in wool now, but the bruises on his legs peeked through the blanket. His eyes were bloodshot, face hollow. But there was something unshakable in him. Something Mira hadn't seen in years. Bruno licked Luna's fingers gently once, twice, then settled again. She likes him, Logan said softer now. He was the one who found us, right? Mira nodded. Why is he missing a leg? Roadside bomb, she replied. Afghanistan. Logan didn't flinch. He saved someone, more than once. He's not afraid. No, she said, but he remembers. They sat in silence. The fire dimmed slightly, and Mira rose to toss another log onto it. The flames surged back to life, stretching taller. Shadows grew again, climbed the cabin walls like they were looking for escape routes. Logan turned to her. You got a name? She hesitated. Then Mira. Logan, I figured. Another beat passed. Then Logan stood. I can feed her, he said, if you want. Mira didn't move for a long second. Then quietly, she handed him the cloth bottle she'd filled earlier, warm milk from powdered formula she never thought she'd use again. Logan took it with steady hands, sat down, offered it to Luna. She latched, and just like that, peace settled across the room. Not a loud, triumphant peace, but the kind that hums under the skin, like the first warm wind after a long, brutal winter. Mira watched them, the boy, the baby, the dog, all three broken, all three surviving, somehow. The stench of gasoline still lingered, even as the flames had long since eaten their fill. Ash clung to the rafters of what used to be a home, if it had ever deserved that word. The walls half collapsed, leaned inward like broken ribs. Smoke curled from the smoldering floorboards, rising into the snow-choked sky like a signal fire no one would answer. Silas coughed once, then again. He dragged himself up from the rubble, a half-burnt quilt hanging off one shoulder. The skin beneath it blistered and raw. His hair was singed, his beard reeking of alcohol and soot. One eye was swollen shut, but the other, the one still intact, burned with something deeper than pain. Rage, boy, he growled. You think you can run from me? His voice cracked the words, ragged and wet. He stumbled forward, kicked aside a charred plank, and found what he'd left behind in the panic, a metal lockbox scorched around the edges, but intact. He dropped to his knees, pried it open with bloody fingers, and yanked out a leather-bound envelope, half melted, but still sealed. Inside a photograph. Old, faded, folded in the corner. A woman Logan's mother standing beside a man Silas hadn't seen in years. And nestled in her arms, a baby. But not just any baby. Luna. His hands clenched around the photo, crinkling it. You lying bitch, he spat. She wasn't even mine. He stared at the man in the picture. The sharp jaw. The eyes like steel. The tattoo just visible beneath the rolled sleeve of a denim shirt. Jonas Mercer. Dead, or so everyone thought. Silas narrowed his good eye. Unless, he shoved the photo into his coat and staggered upright. Fire still crackled somewhere beneath the floorboards. The wind howled around the wreckage. Snow whirled down like judgment. But he didn't feel any of it. All he felt was something old, something mean. This ain't over, he muttered, and he started walking. 300 miles south, a man stepped off a train. No one saw him board. The station was nothing more than a bench under a rusted signpost outside a town, forgotten by maps. Wind slapped his coat. His boots hit the ground with deliberate weight. One carried a limp. Not a painful one, just enough to keep him balanced, like the earth owed him that small warning. He walked past the station, past the diner with the broken neon sign, past the gas station where no one pumped gas anymore. No one looked at him. But everyone noticed, because he didn't belong. Not anymore. Jonas Mercer had learned how to disappear. Years ago, when the flames took his old life, he let them. Let the world believe he was dead. It made things easier. No more parole officers. No more whispered threats. No more bleeding for someone else's mess. But lately, there'd been whispers. A girl, newborn, no father named. A boy, always watching. And a woman who'd vanished just weeks after giving birth. Jonas never believed in fate, but he believed in patterns, and this one was too familiar to ignore. He ducked into a boarded-up shed behind the diner, cracked open a cache hidden beneath the floorboards, and retrieved a steel lockbox, identical to the one Silas had opened hours earlier. Inside another photo, Same woman, same baby, but this one was newer. He ran a thumb over the image, then folded it carefully reverently and slid it into the breast pocket of his coat. He checked the chamber of his pistol. Loaded? He checked the vial in his coat. Sealed. He checked his rage. Unchanged. Jonas wasn't chasing a memory. He was reclaiming blood. The following morning, just as the light broke over the eastern slope of Bitterroot, Miles arrived at a snow-covered roadside rest station, a single outhouse, a locked vending machine, and a cracked map of the Montana backcountry, faded from sun and time. He leaned over the map, breathing heavy, and traced a shaking finger toward a small speck along the tree-line elk ridge. Nothing but pines, cold and loners. A good place to hide, a better place to be forgotten, which meant it was exactly where a boy might run. He punched the glass, shattered it. Blood ran down his hand. He didn't care. He turned back toward the woods and disappeared without a sound. Miles away, Jonas stood in a cabin not unlike Mira's, except this one hadn't seen a fire in years. Empty whiskey bottles lined the mantel. Bullet holes scarred the doorframe. A child's toy lay beneath a dusty couch, untouched. He ignored it. Instead, he traced a route across a topographic map, mumbling names to himself. Dubois, Victor, Elk Ridge. He tapped Elk Ridge twice. Then he pulled out a burner phone and dialed a number no one else knew. A voice answered. Male, uncertain. It's me, Jonas said. Silence on the other end. I need information, Jonas continued. About a boy named Logan, 11, brown hair, thin, running with a baby. The voice hesitated. Then why? Because she's mine. Another pause. He's not. I don't care. Static hummed in the background. Then the voice spoke again. Someone spotted them 2 nights ago. Before the snow hit. North trail beyond Deep Hollow. A cabin. Jonas's lips curled. Send me the coordinates. Click. He stared out the window, the mountains rising like teeth in the distance. And for the first time in years, he smiled. At dusk, Silas found the first track. A sled trail, half buried in snow, not fresh but not old enough to disappear. He crouched low-brushed snow aside and found something glinting a baby's rattle. Pink plastic cracked. He pocketed it. The trail curved toward the high trees. Toward the timberline. He stood, adjusted his coat. His burned skin pulled tight, but he didn't flinch. This ends now, and he followed. Meanwhile, Jonas had already reached the opposite slope. He stood above a frozen ravine, eyes scanning the tree line below. He'd grown up in woods like these. Killed men in woods like these. He recognized the way branches bent, the way smoke drifted sideways from a chimney, barely visible through the snow. There, a cabin, low, quiet, but alive. He knelt and pulled a scope from his coat. Focused. 1 heartbeat. 2. Then he saw her. Tiny, wrapped in a gray blanket, eyes wide blinking at the fire. The baby. His baby. His pulse slowed, then sped up. He lowered the scope and closed his eyes. She had her mother's nose, but the rest was him. She belonged with him, not some stranger, not a boy, not a woman who couldn't keep herself alive. No, he would make it right, even if he had to burn the forest down to do it. Elsewhere, as night closed in, Silas stumbled into a small outpost, a gas station frozen in time. The attendant inside was asleep, radio static humming from a shelf above his head. Silas didn't wake him. He went behind the counter, ripped open the map rack, and stole the only topographical chart still intact. He spread it on the hood of a rusted truck and squinted under the weak porch light. There, barely visible, was a dotted trail marked Ranger Access. He grinned. Shortcut. He turned and walked straight into the woods. No flashlight, no gear, just rage, and one name in his head. Logan? Back on the slope, Jonas lit a cigarette with hands too steady for someone standing in a blizzard. He watched the cabin. No movement, no noise. Good. He didn't need chaos. Not yet. He would wait. Like he always did. Wait for the moment. Wait for them to come outside. And then he would take her. Take what was his. Because death didn't scare him. Prison didn't scare him. But losing blood, that terrified him. And Luna was the last drop he had left. The fire had burned low, casting thin fingers of light across the cabin floor. Outside, the storm had softened to a whisper, more mist than rage, more silence than scream. The wind no longer clawed at the windows. It breathed slow and steady, as if even the mountains needed rest. Inside, Mira sat in the wooden chair by the stove, her hands cupped around a metal mug of hot water and powdered milk. Her eyes, as always, were watching. Not the door, not the forest, the boy. Logan stirred in the cot. A soft groan escaped his throat, as if waking up from someplace far away. His face was flushed now, not from the cold, but from the fever still lurking at the edge of his recovery. He blinked hard against the light and instinctively turned toward the wooden crate where Luna lay. She's okay, Mira said quietly. He looked at her, then looked again, as if only now realizing she was still there. That this wasn't some dream carved from cold and desperation. She's been fed, Mira added. Sleeping now, but not as well as I'd like. Logan pushed himself upright, wincing. She always sleeps light, I noticed. He sat still for a long moment, blanket draped over his legs. Then, without being asked, he reached for a cloth and began wiping the sweat from his neck. Mira stood and walked over with the mug. He hesitated, then took it. "Thank you." She nodded once, sat across from him. The silence was thick but not empty, not anymore. After a moment, she asked, "Why is she being hunted?" Logan's eyes dropped. The mug trembled slightly in his grip. "I don't know." "You don't? I mean..." He paused, collected himself. "I don't know who her real dad is. My mom never told me." Mira leaned back. "But the man in the cabin? He's not her father." "No, he tried to kill her anyway." Logan didn't respond, not directly. "He said she wasn't his. Called her a curse. Said Mom ruined everything by having her." "And what did you think?" Logan looked up, and for the first time there was steel in his gaze. Quiet steel, the kind that forms not in defiance, but in desperation. "I thought she was the only good thing we had left." Mira studied him for a long beat. The fire cracked softly. Then she stood, walked to the crate, and gently picked up the baby. Luna squirmed in her swaddle, her lips making a soft, puckering motion in her sleep. Mira brought her to the table, laid her gently on a folded blanket, and opened her medical kit again. Her breathing's shallow, she said more to herself than anyone. "The rails are spreading. You notice her fingertips?" Logan leaned closer. "They're blue." He stiffened. "What does that mean?" Mira didn't sugarcoat it. "Oxygen isn't getting to her extremities. Her lungs aren't pulling air efficiently. If I had to guess, we're dealing with congenital bronchial hypoplasia. I've seen it before, a few times. Is it curable?" "With the right treatment. And if we don't have it," Mira met his eyes, "then she won't make it through the next 72 hours. The world slowed. The fire dimmed behind her. The sound of snow ticking against the window became the only thing moving. Logan's face tightened, but he didn't cry. He just reached out, placed 2 fingers on Luna's chest, and watched the rise and fall like it was the only thing anchoring him to the earth. "What do we do?" he asked. Mira didn't answer right away, because she didn't have one. Not yet. Instead, she turned back to the baby, adjusted the wool lining beneath her, then moved toward her shelf. She ran her fingers across the labels of old expired supplies, none of which would help. "Not here. Not now." Logan broke the silence. "You sound like a doctor." "I'm not, but you talk like one." "I used to be a medic," she said. "Combat zones, mostly." He nodded like he understood, even though she knew he didn't. Still, he respected it. She could see it in the way his shoulders straightened slightly, the way his voice calmed. "What's your name?" he asked. She blinked. It was the first time he'd asked, the first time anyone had in years. "Mira." He repeated it under his breath. "Mira." "Then I'm Logan." "I figured." "Luna doesn't have a last name," he added suddenly. "She never got one." Mira glanced at him. Logan looked away. "We didn't have time." The fire behind them hissed again. Mira placed a kettle on the stove and watched the flame catch under it. "I gave my son his name," she said. Logan turned toward her. "What was it?" Mira didn't answer. She just poured more milk into a bottle, added a few drops of herbal compound she'd used in emergency situations, and handed it to Logan. "You feed her. I'll prepare the vapor tincture." Logan nodded. He took the bottle, carefully crouched beside the crate, and offered it to Luna. She latched on, weak but willing. Bruno, who had been lying in the corner, stood and patted over. He settled beside Logan, resting his chin on the boy's ankle, like a guardian. Logan glanced down at him, then leaned closer. "She likes you," he whispered. Bruno didn't move, just blinked slowly, his body still steady. Logan leaned in closer. "You're kind of like her. You keep showing up when we're scared." Bruno's ear twitched. "You remind me of my mom," Logan added softly. "The way she always stood between us and the dark." Bruno let out a breath, a slow exhale that stirred the edge of Luna's blanket. Logan looked up. Mira was at the far table grinding herbs, her back to him. "I know she's not going to make it without help," he said quietly. "But she's all I have. I can't lose her too." Mira's hands paused, then resumed. "She's not gone yet." Logan nodded. He fed Luna slowly, careful not to let the bottle tilt too far. Her fingers curled around his thumb, tiny and fragile and warm. For a moment, the room held stillness, like glass. Then out of nowhere, Logan whispered Mira. She turned slightly. "Why'd you come back from war?" She hadn't expected that. "I didn't," she said. He frowned. "But you're here." "Physically, maybe," she replied. "But everything else, I left it back there." Logan didn't push, but his eyes stayed on her. And for the first time, she didn't look away. "His name was Toby," she said at last. Logan blinked. "My son, Toby." She turned back to her work. "He died while I was gone. Infection. Could have been treated. But there was no one there who knew what to look for. No one who knew the signs. He was 5. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was reverent. "I'm sorry," Logan said. Mira nodded. She didn't say thank you, but she let it sit. Let it matter. Later, when the fire dimmed to coals and Luna had fallen back asleep, Logan pulled the blanket up to his chin and lay on the floor beside her crate. Bruno lay curled at his back like a living wall. Moonlight slanted through the window in broken stripes, painting their small corner of the world in silver. Mira stood by the doorway watching them both. She didn't ask why Logan hadn't taken the cot. She knew. It wasn't about comfort. It was about protection. Bruno shifted, pressing closer. Logan reached back and stroked the dog's fur. "You're a good dog," he whispered. "Better than anyone we had before." Bruno thumped his tail once. "You got her through the woods. You found that woman. Mira." He paused. "Do you think she's going to let us stay?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but Logan took his silence as something close to hope. He leaned closer, resting his forehead against Bruno's side. "You're like her, you know. Strong, quiet, always watching." His voice broke then, just slightly. "I think maybe we were supposed to find you." Bruno licked the side of his face. A single quiet gesture. The boy smiled into the dark. And somewhere Mira watched them both. One hand on the frame of the door, the other pressed to her chest, as if to quiet something inside that had started beating again. Not fast, but steady. Mira didn't sleep. She sat at the edge of the cot, arms crossed, boots still on, staring at the frost-laced window. Her breath ghosted up into the cold cabin air, merging with the shadows around her. The fire had burned low again, but she didn't rise to feed it. She didn't move at all. She was calculating, mapping the terrain in her head, factoring the snowfall, the terrain, the time, and the risk. Luna's breaths had grown more labored in the night. Mira had heard every stuttered inhale, every wet gasp hidden beneath the folds of the wool blanket. She didn't need a monitor or a chart. Her instincts told her everything she needed to know. The baby had 2 days, maybe 3, if she was lucky. And Mira had stopped believing in luck a long time ago. She stood quietly, crossed the room to her rucksack, and began to pack. Logan stirred near the hearth, rubbing his eyes. Bruno, alert as ever, lifted his head and watched Mira silently. "What are you doing?" Logan's voice was hoarse, still heavy with sleep. She didn't stop folding. "There's a ranger station east of here, 10 miles over the ridge. Used to be a field outpost for military medics during wildfire season. If the supply cache is still intact, there might be antibiotics. Pediatric ones. Nebulizers, even." She zipped the outer pocket of the bag, double-checked the map folded inside. Logan sat up straighter. "You're going." "I have to." "I'm coming with you." "No." Her tone was clipped, final. But Logan stood anyway. "She's my sister. If anything happens..." "Exactly," Mira cut in, turning to face him. "Which is why someone has to stay with her." Logan's mouth opened, then closed. Mira's face softened only slightly. "It's a straight trail for the first 5 miles. Then it cuts up steep into glacial runoff paths. I'll move faster alone. I don't care." Mira exhaled sharply and turned back to her pack. She reached into a side pouch, pulled out a vacuum-sealed pouch of powdered milk, and tossed it on the table. "There's enough formula for 2 more days. I'll set up the heating stones before I leave. You can't just leave us here." "I've done worse," she muttered under her breath. "What if you don't make it back?" Her hands paused, then resumed. Logan stood now, blanket falling away from his shoulders, revealing the bruises still healing along his collarbone. He didn't seem to notice the cold. Or maybe he didn't care. "I'm not staying," he said. Mira didn't respond. He walked toward her. Bruno rose and padded over, positioning himself between the two of them, as if ready to play mediator. "Look," Logan said, voice calmer. "You said it yourself, she has days. But if something happens to you out there, she's alone." "She won't be," Logan pointed to the baby. "She's a newborn. You think Bruno can make a bottle?" "I think Bruno would die trying." As if hearing his name, Bruno stepped forward, rested his chin against Logan's knee. The boy glanced down. Bruno didn't move. Mira sighed. "That's not fair," she said, more to herself than them. "I can keep up," Logan said. "No, you can't." "I will." Mira turned to the table, pulled out a folded cloth, and began loading it with supplies. 2 thermal packs, 1 heating canister. You carry the spare gloves. No arguments. Logan's eyes widened. "You mean, you fall behind, I leave you? You slow me down, we turn back. You give me attitude, I tie you to a tree and keep walking." Logan grinned, just barely. Bruno gave a soft huff that might have been agreement. An hour later, they stood outside the cabin, wrapped in every layer they owned. Mira had armed herself with a .22 hunting rifle and strapped a combat blade to her thigh. She checked Luna one last time, tucking her deeper into the cot with 2 hot stones beneath the frame to radiate heat. Bruno pressed his nose gently against the baby's cheek before turning toward the door. "Stay," Mira said firmly. But the dog didn't budge. She glared at him. Bruno sat, then stood again, then pressed against Logan's leg. "You've got to be kidding me," Mira muttered. Logan smiled. "He doesn't listen well." Mira stared at the dog. "You'll slow us down." Bruno wagged his tail once. Logan knelt, whispering into his ear something Mira couldn't hear. Bruno sat still after that. Silent agreement. Mira looked between them. Then back at the woods. 3 bodies in this weather, she said. "We'd better not die." The trail out of the cabin started, gentle, snow-packed, but passable. Logan kept pace surprisingly well, his breath white against the morning chill. His footsteps steady despite the weight of the pack Mira had forced on him. Bruno trotted ahead, sniffing the trail ears twitching at every sound. They didn't talk, not for the first hour. Each step was a small war against the wind, the cold, the fatigue already settling into Logan's legs. But he didn't complain, not once. He watched Mira closely, mirrored her stride, learned her rhythm. And Mira watched him, out of the corner of her eye, the way his hands never left the straps of the backpack, the way his eyes scanned the woods like they expected monsters, the way he kept whispering to himself when the wind got loud. They reached the halfway marker just after midday. A broken-down wooden sign, half covered in snow, North Ridge service route, emergency use only. Mira stopped, pulled out the water canteen, handed it to Logan. He drank, lips trembling. Bruno nosed the canister. She poured a little into her hand and let him drink. "Still want to keep going?" she asked Logan. He nodded. "I'm not tired." She didn't challenge it, because she could see the shaking in his knees, but also the fire behind his eyes. She started walking again. The climb began. The trail narrowed into a single line of compact snow clinging to the side of a ridge. One misstep would send them tumbling 30 feet into deadwood and broken ice. Mira led carving steps with her boots, placing each foot with surgical precision. Bruno followed. Logan trailed behind, slower now. His breath came harder. He slipped once, caught himself with a grunt. "You okay?" Mira called back. "I'm fine." She kept going. The clouds above began to shift. Gray thickened into steel. The wind returned, not howling yet, but whispering louder. The kind of whisper that warned of something bigger forming just out of sight. By the time they reached the rock face, the temperature had dropped 5 degrees. Bruno growled low. Mira froze. Ahead, a snapped tree. Prints, barely visible. Human. "Someone's been through here," she murmured. Logan looked up. How long ago? Hard to say. But they were moving fast. "Could it be?" "I don't know," she replied. But she did, and that made her fingers tighten on the rifle. They pushed on. As dusk approached, Mira spotted the peak. Beyond it, the ranger outpost. Nothing more than a silhouette now. A squat structure just past the tree line, shrouded in mist and falling snow. But it was there, and if it still had power. She picked up speed. Bruno followed. Logan stumbled again. This time, he dropped to one knee. "I'm good," he gasped. "Just need a second." Mira turned back, reached him in 2 strides. "You've already done more than enough. I'm not stopping." She looked at him, really looked. His lips were blue again, his face drawn tight. But his fists were clenched and his body leaned forward like he was daring the mountain to knock him down again. "You are the most stubborn kid I've ever met," she said. "Good," she smiled, just barely. Then pulled him up. Together they climbed the last stretch, hand over hand. Step by brutal step. Bruno barked once, a short alert. The cabin was just ahead. And behind them, far down the slope, another sound echoed faintly. A crunch, a pause, then nothing. But Mira knew that kind of silence. She'd met it before. And it never came alone. The snow turned cruel. What had been a steady fall now whipped sideways in violent sheets, driven by a wind that tore through the treetops and howled against the narrow cliff trail like a living thing. Logan clutched his scarf tighter around his face, head-bowed boots slipping every few steps. Bruno stayed close beside him, body low to the ground, fur crusted with frost breath, short. Mira led the way. Her eyes were squinted against the storm-gloved hand gripping the rifle, not for use, but balance. Every step she took had to be deliberate. A wrong move wouldn't mean a stumble. It would mean death. The ridge was a knife's edge. To the right, a sheer drop down 50 feet into a tangle of jagged pines and frozen river. To the left, the slope climbed in sharp angles of rock and dead roots, barely enough space to plant a foot. This way, she called back, voice nearly drowned by the wind. Logan didn't respond. He just followed. Every muscle in his legs burned. His fingers had gone numb long ago, even beneath 2 layers of gloves. His breath wheezed in and out, too fast, too cold. But he didn't say a word. He kept his eyes on Mira's boots and forced his body forward 1 step at a time. He couldn't afford to fall behind. Not now. Not when they were this close. Miles behind, Jonas knelt at the edge of a frozen clearing. Snow clung to his beard, his shoulders, his eyebrows turning him ghost-like in the pale light of late afternoon. But his eyes burned dark and alert, scanning the trail like a predator. In front of him, a carcass, a young deer, fresh kill. The bullet had entered cleanly through the neck. Exit wound jagged on the other side. It hadn't been hunted for food. No attempt had been made to gut or skin it. This had been a warning, or a mistake. Jonas crouched lower. Snow had begun filling in the tracks, but the weight of boots had left deep prints. 2 sets. 1 large, 1 small. Dog prints layered through. He touched a gloved finger to the blood-stained snow. Still warm beneath. "They're close," he whispered, then stood. He glanced up at the mountains, scanning the ridgeline. Wind screamed overhead, and in the distance, a shape. Faint. "Moving," he smiled. Back on the ridge, Mira slowed suddenly. Logan saw her hand go up, signaling a stop. He froze, chest heaving. Bruno paused too, nose raised, ears forward. Mira didn't move. She stood perfectly still, head tilted. Then she pointed ahead. 10 feet in front of them, the path narrowed around a fallen tree split by lightning some time long ago. Its splintered base rose like twisted ribs from the snow. But it wasn't the tree that had stopped her. It was the silence. The kind of silence that screamed. She stepped forward, careful, and reached out with the butt of her rifle, brushing the snow from a dark shape just beside the trail's edge. A cable, thin, taut, half buried in the drift. Trap, she muttered. Logan's eyes widened. Snare line, military grade. Whoever set this didn't want animals. Bruno growled. Mira stepped back, studied the area. Then her eyes narrowed. There. She pointed to a second line. This one nearly invisible, strung low across the trail, attached to a trigger mechanism nestled under a patch of moss. Tripwire. Logan took a step back. You think it was set for us? Mira didn't answer, because she knew the answer. Instead, she reached into her coat, pulled out a small pair of wire cutters, and crouched beside the trap. Don't move, she warned. Not until I say. Bruno sat obediently. Logan stood perfectly still, sweat freezing against his back. Mira clipped the line. Nothing happened. Then a soft click beneath the moss. She froze. Shit. But before she could stand, Bruno lunged. He slammed into Logan's chest just as the trap sprang. A steel claw whipped up from the ground with a hiss of coiled force, snapping shut in the air where the boy had been standing a second earlier. They both hit the snow hard. Logan gasped. Bruno growled, standing over him, one leg trembling from the exertion. The trap twitched, then went still. Mira let out a slow breath. You good? She asked, already moving toward them. Logan nodded wide-eyed. He pushed me. Damn right he did. Mira knelt beside Bruno, ran her hands along his side, checking for damage. A scratch. Bruising. No blood. She exhaled. Good boy, she murmured, pressing her forehead briefly to his. Bruno wagged his tail once, then sat heavily in the snow. We keep moving, Mira said. Fast. Logan got up shakily, his gaze fixed on the clawed trap still twitching in the snow. Who said something like that? Someone who doesn't want company. They continued on. The climb worsened. Roots gave way to ice. Rocks crumbled beneath their feet. Logan fell twice once, scraping his knee badly, though he said nothing. Mira hauled him up both times without a word. But her own strength was fading. Not that she showed it. Not directly, but Logan saw the way she paused more often, the way she held her ribs when she thought he wasn't looking, the way she coughed into her sleeve wet, hacking. Blood speckled the inside of her glove. She turned away quickly. Logan stepped closer. Are you sick? No, she lied. You're coughing blood. It's an old injury, nothing new. Doesn't mean it's not dangerous. Mira didn't respond, because she could feel it. The tightness in her chest had returned, the kind that wrapped around the lungs like wire. It had started last winter, maybe earlier, but she'd ignored it. Just like everything else. She didn't have the luxury of weakness. But now it pressed on her ribs like an anchor. Logan placed a hand on her elbow. She flinched. He didn't pull away. Don't die, he said softly. She needs you. I need you. Mira stared at him. For a second, she almost said something. Then she nodded once, pulled a flask from her coat, and drank. Not whiskey, not now. Just water. Cold, burning her throat. She wiped her mouth and kept walking. They reached a plateau as the last light of day bled out across the mountains. The snow had deepened again, and the wind was returning. Bruno barked once, short, low. A warning. We set up shelter, Mira said. Logan looked around. Here? No time to push further. She dropped her pack, began clearing snow beneath a rock overhang. Logan joined her, working fast, hands numb. Bruno circled the area, sniffing the wind, then returned to stand guard beside them. Within minutes, Mira had built a windbreak from thermal blankets and pine boughs. She dug out a stove, fired it up, and poured the last of their heated water into 2 canisters. Logan held his close, warming his hands. Will the storm hit tonight? He asked. Mira didn't answer, but she looked at the sky, and that was enough. Miles below, Jonas stood in the clearing where the snare had failed. He looked down at the steel jaws, still open, still stained with frost. A smear of boot print, dog hair on the wind. He knelt, touched the blood. Fresh. He stood, lifted his head, and smiled. They were close, so close he could smell them, and the storm would do the rest. Back at the shelter, Mira lay still beside the fire, eyes closed, but body tense. Logan watched her from his corner of the cave. Bruno curled between them. He couldn't sleep. Not when every breath Mira took sounded like a battle. Not when every gust of wind outside sounded like footsteps. He reached out and rested a hand on Bruno's back. The dog stirred, then settled again. You saved me, Logan whispered. Again. Bruno blinked. She doesn't want to admit it. But she's scared. He glanced toward Mira. Her face was pale, sweat glistening on her temple. She's hurting. Bruno licked Logan's wrist. I'll help her, Logan said. No matter what. The wind outside howled louder. Snow drifted into the edge of the cave, curling around their boots. But inside, beneath the flicker of the fire, there was still breath. Still warmth. Still will. And sometimes that was enough to keep death waiting. The cave swallowed them. Not in darkness, there was still a flicker of firelight, but in silence. In a hush so deep it felt like the world itself had paused to catch its breath. Snow blew across the entrance in swirls of white dust, soft as ash. The storm had thickened, covering the trail behind them, muting the sound of everything beyond. Outside, the wind roared like a creature hunting through the trees. But in here, time held its breath. The fire burned low between the rocks, barely more than a pulse. Logan sat with his back against the stone wall, knees tucked to his chest, arms curled around them. Bruno lay beside him, head resting on the boy's boot, eyes half closed, but alert. On the other side of the flames, Mira rested, reclined against her pack, her coat still buttoned to her chin. Her breathing was uneven, her cough more frequent now. She didn't say anything about it anymore. She just let it happen like something she'd made peace with long before this night ever arrived. Logan didn't speak. He just stared into the fire. The flames reflected in his eyes, painting them gold. Luna slept in a swaddle between them, her tiny form rising and falling in a rhythm that felt too fragile to trust. The heat stones had cooled. The milk was nearly gone. But her face was calm now, no longer pinched or purple. Her breath, while shallow, was steady. Mira broke the silence first. It was like this. Logan turned his head toward her. What was the night I lost him? Her voice was quieter than the fire, yet it cut through the stillness like a knife. Logan didn't move. Mira took a breath. It rattled in her chest like loose metal. She exhaled slowly and looked at the ceiling of the cave, where icicles formed slow, glistening daggers. We were stationed outside of Tagab Valley, northeast Afghanistan. March. The snow hadn't melted yet. Logan listened without blinking. There were kids everywhere. Always were. They'd wait near the gate in the mornings, hoping for food, old batteries, sometimes shoes. Most of us just kept our heads down, but there was this one boy, always smiling, always offering help even if no one asked. Her eyes drifted toward Luna. He didn't speak English. I never learned his name. But he'd stand next to me at the well every day and mimic everything I did. The way I moved my hand, the way I checked pressure valves, the way I lifted a bandage. He wanted to be a medic, even if he didn't know the word for it. Logan swallowed. 3 days before we were set to pull out, there was a call about an IED suspected near the eastern perimeter. I went with the recon team. Didn't want to. Something felt off, but I went. Her voice dropped. We weren't gone more than 20 minutes. She looked down at her hands. When we got back, the whole market was gone. Smoke, fire, bodies everywhere. Her fingers twitched like they were trying to remember what they'd once held. He'd come to the gate again that morning to give me a scarf he'd made from scrap cloth. I didn't take it. Told him I was busy. Told him I'd see him later. See ya. She paused. Logan didn't breathe. I never saw him again. Silence. Then the fire cracked, and Mira blinked once, as if remembering where she was. I told myself it wasn't my fault, she whispered, but I didn't believe it. Logan rubbed his hands together, the skin raw and pink. He wanted to help people, he said. Mira nodded. So do you. Her mouth pulled tight. That didn't save him. It saved us. His voice trembled on the last word, but he didn't let it fall. You saved us. Mira looked at him, and for the first time there was no edge in her eyes. Only grief, only something human. Logan's jaw tensed. I didn't want this, he said suddenly. None of it. I know. I just wanted her to live. That's all. Just her. His voice cracked. I don't want to keep running. I don't want to sleep in the cold. I don't want to hide every time someone knocks at a door. I just want her to smile. Just once. His chest heaved. I don't care if I die. But she can't. Please, just not her. He broke. The tears came fast, spilling down his cheeks and disappearing into his scarf. He hunched forward, arms shaking hands over his face. And then a warm nose pressed into his neck. Bruno. The dog leaned into him, not gently, but firmly, as if holding him upright, as if anchoring him to something bigger than the pain. Logan sobbed harder. Bruno licked his cheek once, then again, slow, intentional, and Logan let him. He didn't pull away, didn't flinch. He just held on, to Bruno, to the warmth, to the only creature in the world who didn't ask him to be strong. Across the fire, Mira watched. Her hand moved without thinking, reaching toward the edge of the flames, resting on the stone between them. And that's when it happened. A sound, soft, high, like a bubble popping in sunlight. Luna giggled, not loud, not long, just once, but unmistakable. Logan froze, his head whipped toward her. The baby lay curled in her wrap, her eyelids fluttering her lips, forming the shape of something almost joyful. Another giggle escaped her, this one louder. Bruno wagged his tail. Mira stared, mouth parting slightly. That. Logan was already crawling across the stone, leaning over her hands, trembling. Luna. She giggled again, blinking up at him, a sound like dawn cracking over a frozen world. Then she reached for him. Fingers curled, arms wobbled. And she smiled. Real, full, toothless and glowing. Logan laughed. The sound escaped from somewhere deep in his chest. A sound he hadn't made in months. It broke through the tension in the cave, like sunlight through the clouds. She smiled, he whispered, looking up at Mira. She's never done that before. Mira didn't respond right away. She was staring at the baby like she was seeing something sacred. Something resurrected. She's a fighter, Mira finally said. Logan nodded, tears drying on his cheeks. She's everything. Bruno stepped forward, nosing the baby's hand. Luna gurgled in response. Outside, the wind still screamed. But inside the cave, something changed. Something shifted. The weight they'd carried up that mountain, the loss, the guilt, the grief, it hadn't disappeared. But it had cracked. It had made room for something else to breathe. Hope. For the first time in what felt like forever, Logan believed they might make it. Not because the storm had ended, not because the danger was gone, but because Luna smiled, because she laughed, because somehow, in the middle of a frozen cave on the edge of the world, she had chosen to live. Mira lay back, her head against the wall, breath wheezing slightly, hand pressed against her ribs. But she was smiling. It was faint, almost invisible, but it was real. She looked at Logan, at the way he cradled his sister, at the way Bruno curled beside them, like a sentinel. And for the first time in years, Mira whispered a name she hadn't said aloud. Toby. Logan turned. What? She shook her head. Nothing. Just memory. Just a ghost, finally laid to rest. She closed her eyes, let the warmth from the fire kiss her face. The pain was still there. So was the sickness. But she didn't feel hollow anymore. She felt whole, even if just for this one night. And outside, far across the snow-drenched trees, Jonas stared at the ridge from a frozen ledge. He didn't know about the smile. He didn't hear the laugh. He only saw the tracks. He followed them without sound, without warmth, without doubt. He was coming. But inside the cave, they didn't care. Not yet, because for now, Luna had laughed, and that had changed everything. The fire had burned down to embers. A faint glow warmed the inner curve of the stone cave, casting just enough light to trace the silhouette of 3 huddled forms and one dog curled like a sentinel at their feet. Mira had drifted into a shallow sleep. Her face, even in rest, was tense, as if her mind refused to release the weight it carried. Luna slept too, tucked beneath the last of the thermal blankets, her tiny fingers curled beneath her chin. Logan watched her from only a foot away, still sitting upright, arms crossed, eyes heavy but unyielding. Bruno slept beside him, his breath steady and rhythmic, chest rising and falling in sync with the wind's gentle exhale just beyond the cave's edge. Then the sound shattered the silence. A single gunshot, crack loud and violent, echoing like a whip across stone and snow. The bullet didn't hit anyone. It struck the stone above the cave entrance, spraying sparks and rock dust across the floor. Luna jolted awake and started crying. Mira bolted upright, grabbing her side with a gasp, blood already seeping through her layers from the movement. Bruno growled deep, guttural, primal. His eyes snapped open, ears rigid. Logan froze. Another shot fired, this time lower, closer. Warning! They weren't alone. Mira pulled herself up with a grunt, pushing past the pain and dragging herself to her knees. Get down, she barked. Logan grabbed Luna, held her close to his chest, dropping to the floor as Mira crawled across the ground toward her pack. Outside, a shadow moved across the snow. Heavy steps. Deliberate. Closer. Mira found the rifle. Her fingers fumbled on the stock. She turned toward the entrance, raising the barrel just as the silhouette filled the cave mouth. Jonas, backlit by the storm, taller than he looked in the photo Logan had once seen. His coat was heavy dusted and white. His eyes cold, empty, but focused. On the baby. Step away, Mira hissed. Jonas didn't flinch. I only want the girl. Logan's voice cracked from the shadows. She's not yours. Jonas cocked his head. Oh, but she is. She always was. Bruno growled again, standing now between Mira and the man in the entrance. Jonas lifted his weapon. You're outgunned. You're out of time. I've seen worse, Mira replied. You won't see anything when you're dead. And then he fired. Mira dove sideways too slow. The bullet sliced across her upper arm, tearing through jacket and flesh. She grunted, hit the ground, and rolled behind a rock outcropping. Blood splattered the floor. Logan screamed. Bruno leapt. The dog moved like lightning, his body a blur of muscle and fury. He launched at Jonas, knocking the man backward into the snow. They tumbled down the slope just outside the cave's entrance, snarls and shouts tangled into the wind. Mira clutched her arm, breathing hard. Logan, I'm here, he called, cradling Luna behind the fire pit. Get the pistol. Bottom of my pack. Logan fumbled. His hands shook as he tore through the flap, found the cold metal weight buried beneath gauze and spare flares. Outside, Bruno yelped. Then silence. No more growling. Just footsteps. Crunching back toward them. Mira forced herself up. Her left arm hung limp, soaked red. Give it to me, she said, reaching for the gun. But Logan held it. She blinked. Kid, He stepped forward. Not past her. Beside her. Jonas appeared in the mouth of the cave again, bleeding from his temple, limping slightly. but standing, holding a knife now slick with Bruno's blood. He paused when he saw the boy standing there, arms shaking, gun raised, pointed right at him. "Well, look at that," Jonas murmured. "Brave little man. Don't come any closer." Jonas took a step. Mira raised her voice, raw, desperate. "You take another step and you die here." "Not from him," Jonas sneered. Logan's hands trembled violently, but he didn't lower the gun. "She's mine," Jonas said. "That girl. She was stolen from me." "She was saved from you," Logan shouted. Jonas laughed. It was low, humorless. "You think this world cares about saving anything? You think it rewards that?" Another step. Logan's thumb clicked the safety off. He barely knew what he was doing. But he'd seen enough in Mira's lessons, enough in the way her hands moved when she loaded a clip, enough in the weight of this cold machine in his grip. "Back off," he warned. "She's my blood. She's my sister. Blood wins. Not this time." Jonas raised the knife. And that's when Mira screamed. Not from pain, not from fear, but from rage. "Logan," she shouted. "Don't wait until your sister sees her last light. Don't let him take her into the dark." Jonas charged. Time snapped. Logan pulled the trigger. The blast was deafening in the cave. Recoil slammed into his arms, knocking him back. His ears rang. His vision blurred. Jonas stumbled, then fell hard. The knife clattered to the stone floor. Silence returned, broken only by Luna's cry. Logan dropped the gun and rushed forward, tears hot in his eyes. He collapsed beside Mira, who was bleeding badly, but still upright, hand pressed tight against her arm. "You did it," she whispered, hoarse. He shook his head. "I didn't want to. I didn't want to become him." Mira cupped the side of his face with her uninjured hand. "You didn't. You became what she needed." Bruno limped into the cave. He was bloodied, one ear, torn a gash across his shoulder, but he was alive. He collapsed beside Luna, licking her knee gently. Logan reached out and pulled him close, holding both his sister and the dog like anchors in a sea that had nearly swallowed them whole. Outside, the storm howled again. But inside the cave, the darkness had passed. Not all of it, but enough. Snow exploded behind them. The blast shattered the hush of the forest, sending birds shrieking from distant pines, scattering white ash like a storm inside a storm. The makeshift lean-to Jonas's trap-laced shelter was no longer standing. Its timbers had gone up in a wall of fire that rolled through the trees like a second sunrise. Logan didn't look back. He just ran. Luna clung to his chest, bundled tight against his jacket. Her tiny cries barely audible over the ringing in his ears. Mira stumbled beside him, one arm held tight against her chest, blood soaking through her layers. Her boots slipped with every step, but she didn't fall. She couldn't. Not yet. Bruno flanked them both, limping hard, but refusing to stop. Behind them, far beyond the firelight, Jonas's scream echoed. Not of pain, of fury. He was still alive, but not close. Not yet. Logan's lungs burned. His vision blurred. Every footstep felt like it might be his last. But he pushed forward, teeth clenched, breath ragged. "Mira," he called, barely hearing himself over the wind. "How far?" She didn't answer. Not at first. Then through gritted teeth, quarter mile. Ridge, north slope. "We'll make it." "No," she gasped. "You will." The words hit like a blow. Logan spun toward her. What does that mean? But Mira kept moving. And now in the distance, a shape. Low, squat, shadowed beneath the ridgeline. A building. No, a ruin. The old field medical station. They'd reached it. Logan surged forward. The snow grew thicker beneath their boots, drifted high against the walls, swallowing the last of the trail. He wrenched open the door hinges, shrieking, frame sagging, and nearly fell into the room beyond. Dark, cold, abandoned, but standing. Mira collapsed just inside the threshold, her body slamming hard against the wall. Bruno brushed past her, nose twitching ears back. He circled the perimeter, checking shadows, then trotted toward the back wall where a row of ancient lockers rusted into the plaster. Logan dropped to his knees beside Mira. "Stay with me. Please." Her lips were blue, her face pale, but her eyes met his. "Find the comms," she whispered. "Now." He nodded, scrambled to his feet. The room was filled with wreckage, overturned cots, shattered glass, scorched cabinets. The ceiling had caved in near the far corner, letting snow drift through like powdered bone. But near the back wall, behind a metal divider, he saw it. A radio console, big, boxy, dust-covered. He lunged for it, skidding across the floor. Flipped the switch. Nothing. He hit it again. Lights flickered. Faint, red. One bar. Just one. "Come on, come on." He turned the dial. Static hissed from the speaker. He pressed the call button. This is his voice caught. "This is a civilian emergency. 2 people injured. 1 infant. We're at the Elk Ridge Fire Station outpost. Please respond. Please." Silence. Only static. He tried again, louder. "Repeat, this is a civilian emergency. We are unarmed. 1 critical adult. 1 newborn. We need extraction. Please." A pause. Then click. A voice. Crackling. Tinny. Copy. This is Rescue 4 out of Bozeman. Say again, how many injured? Logan's breath caught. 3, he whispered. Then louder. 3, 1 woman, heavy blood loss. 1 infant, low temp lung condition. 1 boy. I'm the boy. Please, we need help. Understood. Is shelter intact? Yes. Coordinates logged. Helo dispatched. ETA 40 minutes. Stay put. Keep warm. Do not move. Logan dropped the mic, then collapsed. Not from exhaustion, from relief. It hit him like a flood tearing through his chest. His arms, his legs. He could barely breathe, barely think. They'd done it. They were going to live. He crawled back toward Mira. She hadn't moved, but she was awake. Barely. I called them, he whispered. They're coming. Her lips quirked, almost a smile. Good. Bruno lay down beside her, pressing his body against her side, sharing what warmth he had left. Logan knelt beside them, unzipping his coat, pulling Luna into his arms. The baby's breath was shallow but steady. She smiled yesterday, Logan whispered, as if reminding the universe. She laughed. Mira coughed. Blood flecked her chin. You remember what I told you? She asked, voice so faint it was more breath than sound. Logan nodded. Everything. Then you know what to do. He shook his head. No, I don't. I need you. We need... Her hand rose, shaky, feather-light, and rested on his. You made it, she said. Tears welled up in his eyes. But you don't stop here, she added. He squeezed her hand. She didn't respond. Her eyes remained open. But her chest, it stopped rising. Bruno whined. Low. Mourning. No, Logan whispered. Please. He leaned forward, pressed his forehead to hers. The wind shrieked against the station walls. Luna whimpered in his arms. And Logan held them both, one against his heart, one against his soul. Outside, the trees bent under the weight of ice and storm. But inside the broken husk of a dying outpost, there was still warmth, still breath, still the echo of firelight. They waited. Minutes passed, then more. Bruno didn't move from Mira's side. His eyes never left her face. Logan sat against the far wall, Luna sleeping on his chest, her tiny hand curled around the dog tag Mira had given him days before. The radio crackled again. Rescue 4, approaching ridge. Visual on smoke plume. Prepare for extraction. Logan stood. Bruno rose. The boy walked to the door, pushed it open. Light bled in from the rising sun behind the trees, gold against white. It cut across the storm like a sword. For the first time in days, the wind changed. Not a howl, a breeze, soft, forgiving. And far above, the thump of rotors echoed down the valley, drawing closer. Logan stepped out into the snow and let himself believe. The helicopter came like a ghost out of the snow. No lights, no siren. Just the distant whomp, whomp, whomp of rotors slicing through wind and cloud, growing louder until the trees shook and snow peeled off the branches in shimmering waves. Logan stood at the edge of the outpost. Both hands raised his coat, flapping violently around his frame. The flare Mira had left in the survival kit burned red at his feet, casting a crimson circle in the blizzard's white chaos. She's here, he screamed into the wind, though he didn't know if anyone could hear him. Inside the structure, Luna whimpered weakly against his chest, bundled tight in Mira's jacket, her tiny breath misting against his collar. Bruno stood beside him, head low, ears flattened by the wind, one leg still favoring the wound Jonas had left on him. But the dog never left Logan's side. The chopper descended. It kicked up a cyclone of snow and debris that forced Logan to turn his back, shielding Luna with his body. He felt the downdraft like a blow to his chest, like the breath of something massive and divine descending to touch the earth. When the skids finally hit the ground, 2 rescue medics jumped out. Their silhouettes were bulky in white coats, visors down, hands already reaching. Infant male, juvenile, unresponsive adult female. Inside, Logan shouted as they approached. They didn't hesitate. One of the medics scooped Luna from Logan's chest with practiced gentleness. The other grabbed Logan's shoulder, steering him toward the helicopter. Logan resisted. Mira's inside. The medic paused. Where? Logan pointed toward the building. Back wall. She's bleeding. She passed out. You have to. But the medic was already moving. Logan turned to follow, but the one holding Luna stopped him. You need to stay here. We need to get her stable. I'm not leaving her. But they weren't listening. Luna was already inside the helicopter, the second medic sliding her into a thermal pod, her vitals being read on a flickering portable monitor. The whir of machines inside the cabin sounded like another language entirely, a language of rescue, of science, of fragile hope. Bruno barked once. Logan turned. The other medic emerged from the doorway, Mira draped in his arms like a broken thing. Blood soaked her left side. Her face was ghost white. Her hand hung limp, fingers curled like they were still reaching for something. No, Logan whispered. The medic didn't speak. He rushed past, laying Mira down on the stretcher just inside the chopper's bay. Another responder connected an oxygen mask to her face, then started compressions. The cabin lit up with LED white. A blur of hands, movement, Urgency. Logan stood frozen outside the open bay. Is she breathing, he asked. No one answered. Mira, he shouted. No answer. Please don't let her die. He tried to step forward, but a third medic blocked him. We're working on her. Stay back. She saved us. You don't understand, she. His voice cracked. The words hit the snow and died there. Inside the cabin, Mira's chest rose once under the pressure of the medic's hands. Then again, but slower, shallower. Charge paddles, someone called. Logan watched through the haze of falling snow, his body numb. And then, nothing. No movement, no sound from Mira, just a flatline whine. Logan moved to rush forward, but Bruno stepped in front of him, blocking his path. The dog growled low, not to threaten, but to stop, to hold him back. Logan shoved him. Move, Bruno. But the dog wouldn't. He just stood there, panting. His body pressed against the side of the helicopter, his eyes locked on Mira's face. Logan dropped to his knees. He couldn't scream anymore. His voice was gone. He pressed his forehead to Bruno's fur and whispered, She can't leave us. Not now. Inside the cabin, Mira's body remained still. No response to the paddles. No flicker in her eyes. No breath against the oxygen mask. Just the steady beeping of a machine refusing to lie. And then for a long second, the monitors stopped. Everything stopped. Time froze. Logan sat in the snow, shaking his breath ragged and wild. Luna cried from inside the pod, muffled by the seal. Bruno lay down slowly beside Mira's stretcher, his head resting against the metal frame. His eyes fluttered. The dog was fading too. He was bleeding again. His leg trembled with every shallow breath. But he didn't leave her, didn't move, just curled beside her like he had the night she took him in. Like he had for Logan, for Luna, for all the broken pieces of all the broken people she tried to carry. Logan crawled forward just past the barrier the medic had put up. No one stopped him this time. He reached for her hand, cold, but not gone. He gripped it tight. Don't leave us, he whispered. Please, not after everything. Her fingers didn't squeeze back, but they twitched, slightly. Then the beeping began again. One note, then another, a rhythm, faint, struggling, but there. The medics froze for half a breath, then lunged back into motion. She's responding, BP's rising, pulse shallow, keep compressions going. Let's go get this bird in the air. The engines surged. Logan's hand never let go of Mira's, and Bruno, bleeding and broken, never lifted his head from her side. As the chopper rose into the storm, the snow curled around it like a closing curtain. But inside, life held on. Barely, but it held. The first thing Logan noticed was the smell. Sterile, metallic, the sharp sting of antiseptic in every breath. He blinked into the harsh white light above him, the rhythmic beep of monitors slicing through the stillness. For a second, he thought he was still in the helicopter. Then the walls came into focus. Canvas, taut and temporary. A field hospital. He sat up too fast. The world tilted. Easy, a voice said gently. A nurse, middle-aged, kind eyes behind a plastic face shield. She placed a hand on his shoulder. You passed out when we landed. You're safe now. He didn't care. Where's my sister? Stable, she said. They've started the treatment. It's working. He exhaled, but it came out like a sob. And Mira. The nurse hesitated. That pause, half a heartbeat, was everything. No, Logan whispered. She made it through the flight, the nurse said. Longer than we thought possible. She was lucid when we wheeled her in. Then the nurse shook her head. Her injuries were too severe. The bleeding, it was internal. By the time we located it, it was too late. Logan closed his eyes. He didn't cry. Not yet. Not here. She asked us for one thing, the nurse added. To give this to you. She pulled a small envelope from her scrubs. It was worn, corners bent, Mira's name written in sharp capital letters across the back. He took it with trembling hands. The nurse stepped away, giving him space. The envelope was unsealed. Inside, a single piece of paper, folded once. On it, written in black ink, just one sentence. If anyone ever asks why I chose you, then you tell them you were the reason. He stared at the words until the edges blurred, and still he didn't cry. He just folded it back up and pressed it to his heart. Bruno didn't move for hours. They'd let him into the medical tent without protest. There wasn't a soul in that camp who didn't understand. He lay beside Mira's covered body, his head resting on the rise of her chest, as if waiting for one more breath. He hadn't eaten. He hadn't barked. Just waited. Logan approached slowly. The nurses had offered to take the dog away, but he'd said no. Not yet. Now, as he knelt beside them both, Bruno looked up at him. His eyes were bloodshot, dulled. His body trembled with exhaustion. She's gone, Logan whispered. But you already know that. Bruno didn't move. I don't think she wanted to leave us, Logan added. But I think she knew it was the only way we'd find where we belonged. He reached out, ran a hand down the dog's side. You can let go now if you need to, he whispered. But if you want to stay, I'd like that too. Bruno whined, just once, and then nudged the boy's knee with his nose. Logan nodded. I thought so. 2 days later, the storm broke. Sunlight poured over the camp like forgiveness. The doctors told Logan Luna was responding well to the treatment. Her oxygen levels had stabilized. Her color returned. The fluid in her lungs was draining. She wasn't out of danger, but she was past the worst. She's a tough one, the lead physician said. Stronger than most. She takes after her family, Logan replied. The doctor raised an eyebrow. Speaking of, he motioned toward a woman across the yard, late 30s, wrapped in a red scarf and long wool coat. Her hands were cradled around a mug of tea. She looked up, smiled when she saw Logan watching. That's my wife, the doctor said. We've been talking. About what? About you and your sister. Logan tensed. Hey, the doctor said softly. Nothing's decided unless you want it to be. But my wife and I, we've been trying to adopt for a few years. Lost 2 to the system. Timing never worked out. But you and Luna, Logan's shoulders straightened. You don't have to. No, the man said. We don't. But maybe we're supposed to. Logan looked back toward the tent where Luna slept, then down at Bruno lying at his feet, then back at the man. Can I think about it? Of course. Later that night, Logan sat beside Luna's crib, watching her sleep. The machines beside her blinked and breathed, keeping track of every fragile miracle inside her. Bruno lay at his back paws, curled under his chin. Logan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out the envelope again. He read the words slowly, over and over. You were the reason. His fingers curled around it. Then he stood. He walked outside. The field hospital was quiet. The stars above were impossibly bright, like holes in heaven's ceiling. He stepped around the back of the tent, where a small memorial wall had been built out of river stones. Names had been scratched into them with pocket knives and pens. He found a smooth one, knelt, pulled out a marker, and wrote, Mira, mother, soldier, savior. He placed it near the top above all the others, and whispered, I'll take care of her, I promise. Then after a pause, and I'll take care of me too. Morning broke gentle and soft. For the first time since the blizzard began, the mountains breathed without pain. Snow still covered everything, but now it glistened beneath sunlight instead of rage. The camp stirred slowly, warm air rising from chimneys, the hum of heaters fighting back the cold. Inside the medical wing, Luna woke first. She blinked against the morning light, then kicked one tiny foot free from her blanket. Logan smiled down at her. Good morning, Trouble, he said. Bruno wagged his tail once. The doctor returned later that morning with the adoption papers in his hand. You don't have to sign today, he said. Logan nodded. I know. He looked at Luna, then at Bruno, then at the man who had kept his sister alive. He took the pen and signed. That afternoon, they buried Mira beneath a stand of cedar trees just beyond the hospital perimeter. There were no speeches, just snow, wind, and quiet. Logan stood beside the grave, one hand on Luna's back, the other on Bruno's collar. The doctor and his wife stood nearby, giving space. The stone marker was simple. Mira Cole, 1976, 2025. She stayed when others ran. As Logan turned to leave, the wind shifted. It wasn't cold. It felt almost like a hand on his shoulder. He didn't look back, but he smiled. That evening, for the first time in weeks, Logan laughed. Luna had sneezed one of those absurd baby sneezes that came with flailing arms and scrunched eyes, and Bruno had jumped, then barked, then licked her nose until she giggled. Logan laughed so hard he fell back onto the bed, arms wrapped around his sister, tears streaming down his face. But this time, they weren't from grief. They were from light, from something returning, from life. The cabin was quiet, not the kind of quiet that presses down on you, heavy with absence. No, this was a sacred silence, one filled with the soft rustle of leaves beyond the window. The occasional creak of wood as it settled into peace, and the sound of life breathing gently in its new rhythm. The table by the fireplace held a small wooden box. It was simple, hand-carved. The corners, imperfect, the grain visible under a light coat of finish. Inside, on a cushion of navy blue felt, lay a weathered military medal. Bronze, tarnished. The ribbon faded by time and war. Logan had cleaned it as best he could, polishing it with the sleeve of his borrowed flannel shirt, until the eagle in the center shone faintly. He reached into his pocket and withdrew a folded scrap of paper, line torn from a notebook. Mira's handwriting was unmistakable, blocky but curved, pressed in hard with a pencil that had broken twice. If anyone ever asks why I chose you, Logan, you are the reason. He didn't cry. Not now. The tears had come in waves those first few nights after the hospital. After the beeping had stopped and Bruno had howled that long, breaking sound in the triage tent. After they'd wrapped Mira in the flag she never asked for, but somehow earned. But now Logan only breathed. He placed the medal into the box carefully, like it might wake her. Then he shut the lid and wrote on the top with a piece of charcoal, for courage. The sun was rising. He stepped outside. The world looked different now, though nothing had changed. The trees were still tall. The snow still clung to the pine needles like soft lace. The wind still carried the hush of winter through the branches. But to Logan, the colors were warmer, the shadows less long. Luna was waiting bundled in her tiny coat. She couldn't walk far yet, but she insisted on trying. One foot in front of the other, she wobbled like the trees might blow her over. "Steady," Logan said gently. She giggled. Bruno waited too. His breath made small clouds in the air, and his gait was slower now. He limped more than he used to. But the fire in his eyes had not dimmed. He wagged his tail once, then padded forward, stopping beside Luna like a sentinel with fur. Together they moved forward, slowly, down the trail Mira had once cleared with her own hands, past the splintered fence, toward the woods. Logan carried a backpack. Inside, snacks for Luna, bandages for Bruno, a water bottle that still leaked slightly at the cap, and Mira's journal. Pages water-stained, dog-eared, written in the same sharp handwriting that always knew exactly what to say. They passed the tree where Mira used to hang her lantern. The hook was still there, rusting quietly. Luna reached out and touched it. Bruno sniffed the base and sat. Logan looked up, and that was when it happened. The clouds broke, not all at once, but in a single golden crack, a beam of light piercing the snow-laced canopy, landing right at their feet. Luna lifted her face, her mouth in an open smile, eyes wide with wonder. Bruno barked once, soft and deep, and Logan, for the first time in weeks, smiled back. A real smile. Not the kind that tried to convince the world he was okay, but the kind that said he would be. His voice was quiet. "Let's keep going." And they did, through the forest, the sun trailing them like a promise. Over the hill, where Mira used to stack firewood. Across the frozen creek, where Bruno paused to drink, and Luna tossed a pebble and clapped. They walked not toward anywhere, but because forward was the only direction Mira had ever believed in. The wind carried the scent of pine, fresh and sharp. Above, the hawk called once and circled. And in the closing narration, as if Mira herself whispered into the stillness, the words came. Sometimes life begins where hope was supposed to end. Sometimes miracles wear fur and limp on 3 legs. And sometimes a woman with nothing left to give becomes the reason 2 small hearts beat again. This is not a story of rescue. It's a story of resurrection. Of broken things mended not by magic, but by mercy. And if you ever find yourself in the dark, remember this. Even the smallest flame can find its way through snow. Fade to black, then a soft return. Logan lifting Luna onto a stump. She laughed, held his face in her mittened hands. Bruno sat beside them, his fur brushed by the golden light. A family not born but built. Not perfect but enough. Not whole but healing. End credits roll over the sound of wind bird song and a heartbeat that keeps going. A heartbeat that never gave up. Mira's medal rests on the mantel beside a framed drawing Luna had made. A woman, a boy, a dog, and a sun so big it touches all of them. For courage, for love, for what comes next. Always what comes next.